So when I offered to talk on Dalit Literatures, it was a kind of an adventure for me because I'll be for the first time talking about something which is basically not part of my experience as such. Because there's a kind of a widespread belief across India that in case you want to address people on Dalit literatures, you got to be a Dalit yourself, because most of the books written by the Dalits, in fact, will always encapsulate only experiences of Dalit people. But here, in fact, I want to venture into this particular area only to contest against it, and in the meanwhile to also kind of take a stand here that if you want to really talk about Dalits, you don't really have to have Dalit experience, but what matters here is Dalit concern. And today I'm here to kind of draw your attention to certain fundamental aspects of Dalit literatures. In the meanwhile, I would want to refer to some books which are basically written in Kannada language. And the vocabulary I'll be using in the meanwhile will also be a little bit in Kannada, because to say a few things about Dalit experience or Dalit consciousness, it will be very required for me to use those words as they are in the books, because the aesthetics of their writings will be lost in case I were to put them in English. So to give you a little bit of introduction about the kind of presentation I have on mind, it's divided into three simple parts. First, I'll be talking about how Dalit studies emerged, and then I'll draw your attention to some Dalit books. In the meanwhile, lastly, I'll just summarize the entire thing by way of referring to some Dalit criticism. So, to start the session with a simple question, anybody has read Dalit literatures? Yeah. Let's just start with certain basics so that things will be a little clear for us as to what we are actually talking about. When it comes to knowing anything about Dalit studies, first we have to understand the word Dalit. Basically, it's on?
Yes, sir.
The word actually is from Marathi language. And the meaning of this particular word is it refers to anybody who is snubbed down, anybody who is crushed, anybody who is marginalized, anybody who is not counted. Meaning somebody who has absolutely no space as such in the social structure will be called a Dalit. And this particular word was coined by a very important person in the history of India called Jyotiba Phule. And he kind of coined this particular word purely because he had certain experiences which in fact were really heart-rending for all of us. And most of these Dalits actually talk to us about their experiences which are purely lifetime experiences, and nothing comes out of their imagination. Because when we are reading Dalit literatures, we have to be 100% sure about one fact, that nothing in fact is from their imagination. Because this is one genre which in fact has got more to do with life-affirming information rather than inspiring us with beautiful language. So I repeat, it's all about just life-affirming information, and it's not really to create a sense of aesthetics in us by way of talking about some beautiful things which trigger out of our imagination. So here, Jyotiba Phule created this or coined this particular word Dalit only because he had experienced certain things which in fact are very painful. And one of the anecdotes which is very interesting is that he happened to go to a marriage with one of his friends who belonged to the upper caste, and unfortunate it was for him that he had to be insulted because he was not invited. And his friend who in fact had invited him also had to cut a sorry figure because he did not know that his friend would be would be given such harsh treatment. And Jyotiba Phule in fact had to undergo this kind of a treatment, and this gave him a sense of awareness about the kind of treatment his people were being given all across India. And one thing he discovered for himself and also for his fellow beings was that this kind of harsh treatment is meted out to people who are Dalits only because they are deprived of education. So this kind of an enlightenment gave him a sense of responsibility for his own people, and his wife Savitribai Phule and he both actually started to educate their own people, because what mattered to them was, in case you want to really forge your identity in India, you need to be educated. And if you really are deprived of education, you will definitely not get one very important thing, that is respect. So all these Dalits in fact actually can be counted among the other two people who are called the others of the society, that is women and blacks. So in case you want to make a list of all these subalterns in this world, there are three people. One is the Dalits, blacks and women. Women of all races and of all nationalities. They are called the others purely because they are deprived of something called respect. And in case you read feminist literature or slave narratives or Dalit literatures, all these three literatures in fact talk more about gaining respect. So what do they do now? In case we want to kind of talk about how this Dalit literature emerged, it has its base in Ambedkar's ideology. And when we are talking about Dalit literatures, we cannot disconnect ourselves from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, because he happens to be the pioneer of most of these Dalit literatures, or all these Dalit literatures, because he actually was the one who gave them a sense of awareness about their identities. Otherwise, all these Dalits in India in fact had come to certain kind of a conclusion about their own existence, that it was routine for them to be treated badly. And they had also kind of left themselves to the hands of fate, because they thought it was only because of their descent that they were being mistreated. And Ambedkar, with his experiences and with his reading, in fact came to terms with the existing situation in India, and he started to read history, because mistreatment of Dalits is something which has got more to do with India's history. So Dalit literatures started to originate purely on the basis of re-evaluation of history, because they started to write something called the history of the downtrodden. And why they had to rewrite history and re-evaluate history? Precisely because when it comes to representation of a person, it all depends on who represents you. And here Dalits were all represented by the upper caste people, and because of their hegemonic dominance, they had in fact marginalized the Dalits as somebody who was the other. And they were so others in the society that they had absolutely no spatial identity as such in the society, and this was understood by Ambedkar, who in fact did intense reading of Indian history. One of the major discoveries Ambedkar came up with was the fact that India's history in fact was not something which was documented by proper historians. Instead, it actually had more of its base only in scriptures and myths. Rather, India's history was confused with myths and Puranas of India. And all of us in fact had taken it for granted that these Dalits in fact have got to be mistreated because it's their fate. And this kind of an understanding that we had about the Dalits was precisely because of our lack of understanding of the fact that history that was written about these Dalits was not authentic. Instead, it was something which actually had its base in only the scriptures. So Ambedkar in fact started to rewrite history by way of re-evaluating all these myths. And myths became his target. Myths became his subject. And he started to give new meanings for all these myths and started to enlighten his own people and gave them a sense of identity by way of saying that you got to reason out your understanding of your own lives, because you're not destined to be what you are. Instead, you have been pushed into oblivion by certain people called the Brahmins. And it was these Brahmins who in fact had written the histories of these Dalits, and their marginalization was purely because of certain kind of history that they had written. And interestingly, when he starts re-evaluating history, Ambedkar starts with the Vedas, because most of us attribute all our understanding of Indian culture to our Vedas, and here Ambedkar takes a dig at the same Vedas. And among the Vedas that were written, which in fact are pretty large in number, he takes a dig at one particular part of Vedas called Purusha Sukta. And he tries to come up with some kind of criticism against this Purusha Sukta by way of raising some very important questions. And this is actually emphatically written in a book called Who Were Shudras? And try to kind of keep track of the bibliography I'll be giving you in the meanwhile, because in case you want to do any kind of extra work on Dalit literatures, these are the basic books that you got to go through before you go to any fiction. And here, when Ambedkar wrote this Who Were Shudras, he in fact re-evaluated all these myths, and when he talks about Rig Veda, he talks about one particular thing called the Purusha Sukta, which is part of the Vedas, and here he raises some very interesting questions. His questions are: no theology across the world is as irrational as India's theology, because in Indian theology, when they talk about the creation of this world, they use more of their imagination so weirdly that they talk about the creation of human beings by equating certain parts of the creator with the existence of certain people of India. I repeat, his surprise here is how come the author of Purusha Sukta used this imagination so widely to talk about the creation of a human being by way of equating the various parts of the creator with the people's existence who came onto this earth. Like, in case you are a Brahmin, you must have come from the head of the Brahman, right? And in case you are the Shudra, you must have come from the feet of the creator. And ultimately, they came up with 4 Varnas in India. Varna, you understand, right? So this Varna system in fact came into existence in India precisely because of our adherence to the Vedas, which in fact has got something called the Purusha Sukta, which is largely and very severely criticized by Ambedkar. And his interesting question here is, how come the creator in fact was so discriminatory against his own people? And what was the kind of logic the creator had before he discriminated against his own people? Right? And the question in fact is quite interesting precisely because how come the creator in fact decided the classes of his own people? And when you talk about the theology of any other country, you don't really have such kind of discrimination made by the creator himself, because discrimination against people on the earth has happened by the fellow beings, not really by the creator himself. But what is interesting about India's theology here is the creator himself had this discriminatory sense. So how can we call him a god? Because he in fact created me from his feet, because of which I am snubbed down. So this is the question that he asks all of us, and he has absolutely no answer for it. Instead, he comes up with a solution for this, that is, you, that is my people, don't really have to think that you are destined to be mistreated, because there is a kind of a flaw in our own theology. And this theology, in fact, is a little flawed precisely because no theology in this world discriminates against people. So, in case we are talking about caste discrimination of people, it is very much implicit in theology itself. So, it's all because of our religiosity that we have become caste-minded. And when he wrote another book called Annihilation of Caste, which basically was a paper that he had prepared to present in a conference that was organized by Jatpat Todak Mandal of Maharashtra, he talks about annihilation of Hindu religion itself because it is quite discriminatory about its own people. And this is a kind of enlightenment that he created among his own people. And in case you want to talk about Immanuel Kant of the 18th century, Ambedkar can be India's Immanuel Kant in the 20th century, because he was the one who gave a sense of enlightenment for his own people. Otherwise, they would never understand what equality meant. They had in fact taken it for granted that inequality is part of life. They have taken it for granted that they had to be in fact treated that badly because they did not know that they also had the chances to upscale themselves, right? And Ambedkar actually gave them a sense of understanding about their own existence, and he actually called for three things which in fact will make an ideal society: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And here he uses the word liberty by way of talking about emancipation of the Dalits from the shackles of the caste hegemony. And from there you got to emancipate yourselves. Don't you ever think that you are supposed to be mistreated because you are born here into a particular caste. For your information, for your bibliography, there's one more book called Cognition and Structure by Veena Das, and in that there's a very interesting book on Jatis in India, and Jati meaning castes. Okay, she talks about how Jatis are constructed in India, and she talks, of course, pretty interestingly about the social structure here in India, and she also has certain information which can be equated with the kind of research that was done by Ambedkar as well. Veena Das's information here is caste in fact depends upon three things. One is descent, next is your locality, lastly your cult. So when it comes to descent, who you are born to, locality, where you are born, lastly cult, the kind of gods that you worship, right? In case I worship a god like Vishnu, I cannot be a Dalit. In case I am worshipping a god like Bhutanatha, then there will be certain kind of suspicion about my identity because people will raise their brows. How come I am seated here on the altar when I worship a god like Bhutanatha? Because it is actually worshipped by the Dalits. So, three things determine our caste. Number one, your descent. Next is locality. Lastly, your cult. What do I mean by locality? Very interesting things. In fact, one of my students who is working on Dalit Literatures actually passed on a very interesting article to me just yesterday as part of his working bibliography, and that actually coincidentally worked in my favor as well because I was preparing for this talk. And when I went through that article, it is actually part of a very good magazine called Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa and Middle East. And in that, the article is all about order and order in Indian structure. Order. You understand order, right? The researcher in this particular article talks about spatial identities of the Dalits. Because Veena Das said something about locality being one of the determinants of the Dalits' existence in this world, you also have to understand what locality means, and this particular article has got some interesting information input about the localities. The Dalits' localities are identified not by areas but by stench, by the odor. And this article, in fact, was not written sometime in the 1950s. Instead, it's a very recent article written very much in the years, that was in 2012. And all of us would actually wonder about the existence of caste discrimination in India even today, but unfortunately, it is very much rampant in some parts of India. And this particular researcher did his survey in Uttar Pradesh. And when he went to a small village, he in fact was accompanied by an elderly person who was showing him around the village because he was a researcher. He had to collect some data, information for his article, and this elderly person in fact was giving him all kinds of information. But most part of the information he gave the researcher were all interesting because he had never expected himself to be given such amazing input about the locality of a particular person being identified by the smell. And this was quite puzzling, intriguing, and also ununderstandable. And he asked this elder person, like, what do you mean by identifying somebody's locality by the stench? Then the answer was very striking. supposing it's a Dobie's area, you'll easily come across a stench that emanates from, or that is emanated from, the half-dried clothes and some kind of a soap that they use. And the smell will be so all-pervasive that you can easily make out that you're walking towards the Dobie's area. Oh, great. How do you identify other castes? If it's somebody like Holayas, you easily make out their area because they smell of filth, human excreta, right? And some of the caste is identified by the cow dung. And these are 100% locality determiners because you cannot get such stench elsewhere. The kind of smell of the soap and the half-dried clothes that you get in the Dobie's areas can never be found in any other area. So, when it comes to the locality determiners of the Dalits, unfortunately, the stench becomes a kind of a trademark for them. And the article actually becomes extremely interesting in the latter half of it because the researcher says that the Dalits or even the Shudras have absolutely no hesitation about smelling like that. And they actually refuse to become part of the bourgeoisie social order of the society because they think the stench makes them. They think the stench is the major distinguishing marker to forge their identities. And it is here that they show their rebellion. Right? When you understand the kind of rebellious attitudes of the Shudras or the Dalits in their writings, you find that rebellion which is very comprehensive. There is that rebellious tone, and in the meanwhile, the kind of language they use also will be a little rebellious because they rebel against the established order of the usage of the language in literatures. They kind of break through everything that is part of the establishment. So, in a way, when you understand Dalit literatures, you should understand that it's all about being anti-establishment to a large extent because they have got their contest or contention against the establishment itself because there is a flaw in the very establishment, and this in fact was emphatically told to them by Ambedkar himself. In case you want to really become quite emancipated from the shackles of all these social orders, you should understand one thing, that is, make sure that you emancipate yourselves fully because the social order is completely flawed. He asked them even to come out of their religion and adhere to Buddhism. Only because this flaw which he found was almost irreparable. It was found to be almost irreparable. Because interestingly, the people who are the causes behind the flaws in the social order actually form only 5% of the population of India. When you are talking about the flawed social order, these people actually form only 5% of India's population. But if you talk about their strengths in fact are precisely because they had got their patent on education. And Ambedkar in fact realized the importance of education here at this particular juncture when he got to know that if 5% of India could dominate over the rest of us, it's only because they had got the patent over something called education. So his call for his people was, in case you want to really emancipate yourselves from the shackles of this religion, make sure that you move to Buddhism, and in the meanwhile, if you really want to become emancipated, it's only through education. So he gave a call for three things: educate, agitate, and organize. Ambedkarite ideology: educate, agitate, and organize. And these three words in fact come out of Ambedkar's books and Ambedkar's voice precisely because he had experienced such caste discrimination and he did not want his people to become part of this caste discrimination anymore. So when he wanted to really enlighten the people, he had to do this a little emphatically, and he did that with his books, he did that with his talks, he did that with his struggles. And from then on, the Dalit literatures started to originate. Right? And one or two things about another book called Annihilation of Caste. like I said, this is a paper that he had prepared for a conference. And the people who had invited Ambedkar to present a paper on castes in India, in fact, had determined to eliminate caste system from the face of India. I repeat, the organizers who invited Ambedkar to this particular conference were determined to eliminate caste system from the face of India. So Ambedkar basically was very happy by this invitation, but there was also a certain kind of suspicion in his mind because the organizers were of the upper caste. So there was a kind of an irony that was implicit in the very organization of this conference, because the people who invited actually were part of the conspiracy against the Bahujanas, that is the Dalits. And how come these people in fact have made up their minds to eliminate caste system from the face of India? Anyhow, he gave his consent and he wanted to become part of it. But there was a small condition that those people had laid. Before you kind of present your paper, we would want to first take a look at your paper and then you might make the presentation. And when Ambedkar sent them the paper, then started the real fight. They wanted the paper to be edited because Ambedkar had called for annihilation of caste. Annihilation meaning complete destruction of caste by way of destroying the very religion itself, because the flaw lies in our own religion. And these people were completely shocked by this kind of an adamant stand that Ambedkar had taken, and they actually had marked certain passages on the paper, and they wanted Ambedkar to just edit out those passages, and the other passages were okay to be presented. And unfortunately, the entire episode had got a kind of a paradoxical end to it, because Ambedkar could not make the presentation. Instead, he had to publish this with great efforts so that it could be of some use for his own people. So the story here goes like this: it was not presented in the conference, and unfortunately Ambedkar, whatever he had on his mind, in fact had to somehow reach out to the people by way of publishing his paper. But he had one problem before he published it, because how will his people understand it? Because they were kind of uneducated. And if he wanted to publish this particular paper, he could have done it million times, and he could have written written millions of papers. But he had one issue here to address himself on. That is, how will my people understand when I publish a paper of this kind? Because they can't read. But anyhow, he had no other go. He had to publish it. Some issues of this particular book. People talk about economic reformation, and here we are now living in a particular era where there is this development that is used largely, right? And Ambedkar had a different idea of development. When you talk about development, when you talk about history, don't talk about any development in terms of economy, because economic development is not really primary to India. Instead, social regeneration is what is important for us. He wanted social regeneration, social reformation for all of us, because we all are mistreating one whole community who in fact are our own fellow human beings. And Ambedkar rewrote history by way of talking about certain part of the history which had never been written at all. Like, people wrote only about the hunter, but they never wrote about the hunted. Right? And here Ambedkar wanted to, of course, write parallel history, and he actually brought the notice of the people to certain aspects of Indian history which never had been written. According to him, people normally talk about the Holocaust when they talk about genocide. But there has been almost unprecedented genocide in India itself. That is, when the Buddhists came to India, when Buddhism in fact started in India, it started to replace Brahmanism. And there were Buddhist monks all over India who in fact had started to spread secularism. And he writes this in a book called Revolution and Counter-Revolution. And here he writes about India's history, which in fact has never been written elsewhere. And he talks about how the Buddhist monks were massacred. And this kind of a massacre, in fact, actually left indelible bloodstains on the books, on the pages of India's history, but nobody wrote about it. And here, when he talks about the caste issues in this particular book, he mentions about social reformation or social regeneration, and when he talks about the caste issues, he provides very interesting examples. He never wrote out of rage. When you read Ambedkar, you should understand that he never wrote out of a sense of rage or a sense of resentment. All his works are research based. And he provides 100% authentic examples and evidences to prove what he is saying is authentic. And when he talks about certain kind of casteism that was prevalent in his place, he provides a very interesting newspaper report in this particular paper, Annihilation of Castes, which in fact was published in Times of India. And the report is that there was a kind of a caste, or there is a caste in Maharashtra called the Mahar caste and the Balia caste, who in fact were being confused for Brahmins because they were dressing up like the Brahmins. You're following, right? They were kind of getting, they were being confused for Brahmins because they were looking like Brahmins because of their dresses. And the Brahmins in fact made certain rules for their code of conduct. In case there is supposed to be any kind of a line between us and the Balayas, there should be some kind of dress code that is supposed to be made mandatory, and the dress code goes like this. You should not wear your mundu, that is your dhoti, till your feet. It should be above your knees. And when you say good morning or good afternoon, or when you wish anybody, your greeting has got to be done by way of bending over your waist. You cannot stand upright with your open chest and say your greeting to anybody. Instead, you got to bend over your waist. And when it came to the women, there were even more stringent rules that were laid down, and these rules in fact were actually made as part of the code of conduct. And this code of conduct is interestingly mentioned even by Veena Das as well in the chapter called Jatis. The code of conduct was drawn up by the Brahmins for one very interesting reason, which is part of India's history. The anecdote goes like this. The Brahmins in fact are divided into several sects. There are Dvivedis, there are Trivedis, there are Chaturvedis. And these Trivedis and Dvivedis had a lot of cows with them. And the young boys of Dvivedi and Trivedi castes had to kind of take the cows out for grazing. And when they actually left the cows for grazing, they had to kind of be fed with some food, and the arrangement was such that there were some women around who had to feed these boys with some food. And when the boys had absolutely no work to do, they actually engaged themselves in some kind of fun romantic games with these women who are feeding them with food. This led to certain kind of promiscuous relationship with these women. And ultimately, some women actually got pregnant. And these people became a little concerned about the kind of development that was happening here, because these women who are feeding food to these guys were getting pregnant without wedlock. And if this continued forever, then there would be absolutely no social order, and the Dvivedis and the Chaturvedis and these Trivedis met and started to draw certain rules. In case there should be any kind of order in this world, then there should be differences among the people. And these differences in fact have got to be written down, and these differences have got to be strictly followed. And those differences are, when we actually are performing yagnas, we should not do it for other caste people, because these yagnas are supposed to be performed only by us and for our own people, and the other people in fact do not deserve the blessings of these yagnas. Likewise, they also laid down certain other rules about marriage as well. and they spoke about one thing called purity. Purity can be somehow sustained only when you follow these rules, and in case you let yourselves be a little entangled with other caste people, then your blood will become contaminated. If you really want to somehow free yourself from such contamination, make sure that you follow all these rules. And the rules became quite stringent for the Brahmins. In the meanwhile, there were parallel rules that were drawn up for the other people, that is the Dalits. And those rules are, you should live outside our localities, majorly. You cannot live with us. In case there is any kind of life that is supposed to be led by you people, that cannot happen in our midst. Instead, it has to happen very much outside our locality, and there is nothing like any spatial independence for you. You cannot own anything. I repeat, the Shudras and the Dalits were not given any freedom or liberty as such to own anything. Like I said, I would refer to some books of Kannada. There's a book called Nomad's Inscape, written by Kuppe Nagaraj. He makes a very interesting beginning to his book. He says, in this vast world, my father did not have even an inch space for himself to own it and to call it his. And this sentence, in fact, kind of has oceanic information about the crisis the Dalits have actually faced for centuries, because they were not given the privilege to own anything. And this is because the rules, in fact, were very stringent and they were followed very strictly. And how did they ensure that the rules would be followed? Simple. The rules were actually made by God, not us, is what they said. In case you really want to ensure for yourselves that some rule has to be followed, then that rule, in fact, has got to be attributed to your scriptures. Anything that comes from scriptures will always be obeyed. Anything that comes from scriptures will always be feared. And these guys, in fact, made sure that the rules were strictly followed by way of saying those things, by claiming that they were representing God. And the Dalits, in fact, followed all that pretty religiously, because they believed that those were the words of God himself. And they believed in something called fate. And this is exactly what Ambedkar hated. Ambedkar questioned. And when he took up Buddhism, or when he converted himself into Buddhism, he took several oaths. Okay, the oaths count up to 25. Okay, and the first oath here is, I don't believe in the incarnation of Brahma, Vishnu, or Maheshwara. And it is this kind of incarnation which, in fact, has played the devil in the lives of all my people. And I want to tell you quite emphatically, quite audaciously, and quite assertively that I don't really believe in the incarnation of Lord Brahma, Lord Shiva, or Lord Vishnu. Right? And the same thing is reiterated by somebody called Sharan Kumar Limbale in his book Towards an Aesthetic of Dalit Literature. He writes about three things: Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. Right? He calls them untruth, unholy, and ugly. Right? Satyam is not really Satya, it is untruth. Shivam, it's not really holy, it's unholy. And whatever you call beautiful is not beautiful, it is ugly. Because you call Satya, what is Satya here? Your scriptures. And all your scriptures, in fact, are not Satya, because no God would want to discriminate against his own people. So anything that you have said about the births of people, in fact, is all flawed, it's misleading, and it is untrue. So there's nothing like Satya in what you have said. And Shivam, it's not really holy. It is not at all holy, because how can you ever ask your own people to practice untouchability against your own people? Because according to Dalit critics and Dalit writers, untouchability is more violent, more brutal than racism. You think about this, you cannot touch a human being because he belongs to a particular caste, and untouchability in fact is supposed to be more violent. And when they talk about Dalit experience, and when they talk quite vehemently that others cannot write or talk about Dalit experiences, precisely because if you really want to talk about untouchability, you should be an untouchable yourself, and you should have understood what untouchability means. Unless you have undergone that kind of trauma, you cannot write about it, is what these Dalit writers say. We should understand that untouchability is something which is more violent than racism. So, there's nothing like holy in the term Shivam because you have untouchability as part of your structure. And ugly. Ugly. You have made your own people clean up the excreta of other fellow human beings. It's ugly. It's ugly. And here, when it comes to this cleaning up of the excreta of the fellow human beings, you should never forget a very prominent writer in Kannada, here in Karnataka, called Devanur Mahadeva, who actually has come up with magnificent works like Kusumabale and Odalala. Also has written a very recent work called Yedege Vidya Akshara, in which he talks about the cleaning up of the excreta of the human beings. It's a book which has got short snippets. Okay, it's not a novel and it's not a big critical work. It's actually a series of his observations of this world. In one of the chapters, he speaks about the cleaning up of the excreta, and this actually comes from his own experience of having to do the same in his own house, where there was a certain problem in his washroom, and because of that he could not kind of get anybody to clean it up because he was against it, and he wanted to do the same thing himself. And when he tried to clean the commode or clear the commode, one thing that came to his mind was, I am finding it quite difficult to do it now because it's not really kind of a pleasant job to do, because cleaning up of a commode is something which takes a large heart for all of us, because we don't really believe in cleaning it up. We know only about soiling it. And here we have to now clean it up, and that takes large heart. And when I wanted to really clean it up, what came to my mind is, let me clean it up because it anyway is part of my own family, my children. And he says, when my own people did this for about centuries, this is exactly what they must have thought. When they cleaned up the excreta of other human beings, they must have thought that these people are like children, let me clean it up. And this takes a lot of magnanimity here in the heart. And he ends the chapter with a question. And the question is, who is dirty? We or you? Right? And the question in fact is pretty simple. We clean up the whole locality by lifting up the excreta of human beings, and you call us dirty? You make us do the job, so you should know who is dirty. So that way, when it comes to this cleaning up of the excreta, Devanur Mahadeva has got something pretty interesting. And here he says, when a society in fact has such kind of discrimination against people, especially this scavenging job, you should understand how ugly the society could be. So Sharan Kumar Limbale's reiteration of Satyam Shivam Sundaram becomes extremely interesting here, because he presents the whole picture of Indian structure. Okay, and another thing which you should understand here is, they not only re-evaluate history, they also come up with certain very interesting observations about the etymology of some words. I repeat, when it comes to knowing anything about the Dalit literatures, we should be quite careful here, because they also do a little bit of research on the etymology of certain words. And I'll give you some 2 or 3 simple examples. First word is, there's a word called Holaya, which refers to a particular jati in India. Okay, and all of us come to some kind of a conclusion that Holaya refers to a person who is a Dalit. But etymology has a very interesting meaning here. Holaya means Holada Odaya, meaning landowner. right? And these are the people who once were landowners, and because of certain kind of cultural politics and hegemonic attitudes of some particular people, these people have now been marginalized. So Holaya means Hola the Odaya, meaning landowner. Another interesting word here is Asura. Asura. Asura actually refers to somebody who is a demon. But here, their understanding of the etymology of this particular word is Sura, Sure. Sure is liquor. Okay. And Sura is the one who drinks liquor. So, Asura is the opposite of it, which means who doesn't drink liquor. So, we are much cleaner. We don't drink liquor. They do. But the meanings that they are giving for these words are interesting. Next, Nagarikate, civilization. And the word Nagarikate is derived from Naga Jananga, Naga community of India. And it is believed that Naga community happens to be the oldest community here in India, and Nagarikate is a word which is actually derived from Naga Jananga. Unfortunately, the people who were here as the natives of India were pushed into oblivion because of certain kind of cultural politics, and this kind of cultural politics went almost unnoticed by all these people because of their ignorance, because of their innocence, right? There's a writer called Kuvempu in Kannada Literatures. He calls for some kind of cognitive revolution in Karnataka in a book called Vichara Mattu Samskrutige Kare. Okay, Vichara Kranti Mattu Samskruti Krantige Kare, or Ahvana. And this particular work, in fact, has some interesting input for all of us. Here, Kuvempu is very, very vocal, very vociferous in saying that only 5% of Brahmins have pushed the rest of us almost to the borders, and we should understand that it has been possible for them not because of their strengths but because of our weaknesses. And our weaknesses have got to be somehow understood by us, and we should stop yielding to them. And he reiterates the same thing in his mega work called Malegalalli Madumagalu, in which there is a character who happens to be a church priest who addresses all the Shudra people and says something very vehemently. And what he says here is, you people have to stop considering the Brahmins as gods, and you should also stop washing their feet and consuming the same water as prasadam. And you've done it? Yeah, I understand that look. And it's a practice here. Okay, and you should stop consuming that as prasadam. And if you keep doing that, it means that you are yielding only to your own weaknesses, and you are actually giving a lot of scope for somebody who has been your master. And this master-slave relationship has to be properly understood by way of staving off your ignorance. And Kuvempu is one very important writer. Though was not a Dalit himself, he wrote out of Dalit concern. So in case you want to read any Dalit literatures, there are three people whom you have to read. Though they are not Dalits, they in fact have written pretty emphatically about their Dalit concerns. That is, one is Kuvempu, the other one is Shivram Karanth, the other one is your Anantamurthy, right? Because Kuvempu becomes very important for us because his work Malegalalli Madumagalu has got very important insights about the lives of Dalits in his place called Malenadu. I'll give you a small example. When he uses the language, he uses two different levels of language in his book. One level of language for the upper caste people, the other level of language for the Dalits. When you read the book, you will understand that the upper caste people in their language have something called authority. So it's called the language of authority. And when the Dalits speak, there is a lot of humbleness there. And this humbleness is caused because of their lack of education, lack of property, and lack of social security or social sense. And whenever these upper caste people address the Dalits in the whole novel, they use a word called Sulemaga, called bastard. Right? And the word in fact becomes very interesting here because the word bastard is coined for them. I repeat, the word bastard is coined for them because bastard is the one who has no father, or parents, who has no father. And this kind of a situation in fact was caused in India because all these Dalit women were treated as slaves and their masters would own their bodies too. And because of their ownership over the bodies of these Dalit women, the Dalit women would get pregnant and unfortunately they would remain as single mothers without having to tell the outside world that the father, though is known to them, cannot be revealed to the world. So these kids would be ultimately living their lives without knowing who their Janaka is, that is the father. So the word bastard actually has a specific connotation. It is not a random word used to just swear at people. Instead, it has a very specific religious and caste connotation. And the whole novel is replete with such usages which are specifically used on these Dalit people. And Kuvempu in fact is unhesitant in using these words abundantly because he wanted to somehow educate all of us that this is the kind of life these Dalits have lived. So when it comes to Dalit consciousness, keep this in mind. The Dalit writers are writing with the sense of Dalit consciousness only to educate their own fellow Dalits. In the meanwhile, it's a kind of an alarm for all of us, the non-Dalits, that we know that we are being exploited. We know that we are being mistreated. We know that we are being unjustly treated. So, when it comes to knowing anything about Dalit consciousness, don't forget Dalit consciousness is nothing but knowing about their existence and rewriting about their existence to claim for some social space. And what is Dalit experience? Dalit experience is nothing but being exploited, being harassed, and being discriminated against. Right? And what is part of Dalit experience? Nothing but deprivation. What are they deprived of? They are deprived of almost anything that is part of our life. I repeat, they are deprived of anything that is part of our life. Okay, what I mean here is, you should read Anantmurthi's Bharatipura to understand what they are deprived of. Okay, there is a character called Jagannatha in the novel who actually comes up with a resolution to uplift his Dalit slaves. I repeat, the character Jagannatha in the novel comes up with a small resolution to uplift his Dalit slaves who are working for him. He starts by way of changing their clothes. Right? And he buys all of them new dhotis. And he expects them to come the next day wearing all their new dhotis, and he will be excitedly waiting for them, and they all arrive on time. But he is kind of thunderstruck to see them wearing all their new dhotis but above their knees and not up to their feet. And he asks them, like, I gave you the new dhotis not to really wear them like this, like how you used to wear your old dhotis. How come like you're dressed up like this like earlier? And they say, the new dhoti was cut in half so that it actually became two dhotis for us. Because all this while we were kind of used to wearing our lungis just like this, and we would continue to wear like this. But he makes it compulsory for them that they have to wear it up till their feet, and he buys them new dhotis again. The next day they all come wearing their dhotis up to their feet, but Anantmurthi's explanation is very interesting here. He says they were all kind of arriving or walking towards Jagannatha as though they were all naked. because they were also uncomfortable to wear their dhotis till the feet. So when it comes to the Dalit experience, it is very much prevalent in deprivation, even from wearing proper clothes, right? And here, what do they write about? Simple. They write about caste discrimination, they write about untouchability, they write about deprivation from education, they write about bonded labor, manual scavenging, and low living standards. But how do they write about them? How do they write about them? They use the language of law, they use the language of rights. I repeat, today's Dalit writers, in fact, are trying to educate their fellow Dalits by way of talking about law. And earlier, there never used to be any protection from law for all these guys, and today they want to tell their own people that law is meant for all of us. Whoever is born on this particular earth called India, in fact, is secure and very much safe under the protection of law. So make sure that you use the language of law. They use the language of rights. You should know what your rights are. You must know what your rights are, because if you don't know what your rights are, then you will always be deprived. And the ultimate call these guys make for all their fellow beings is for dignity. The only call ultimately which you will get as part of their hypothesis of their books is nothing but it's a call for dignity. You should of course make sure that you will all be respected, and in case you don't get respect, it's only because of your own flaws. That is, you detach and disconnect yourselves from education. If you do that, then you are at fault. So these Dalit writers, in fact, write with a sense of rage by way of calling for respect. They want people to understand that you got to know what your rights are, you got to know what law is meant for, and you must know that you actually deserve to be respected. Okay, there's a very interesting writer called Bhama in Tamil. If it's possible, just go through a book called Sangati. Okay, this particular book, in fact, has got an incident involving a Dalit woman and a upper caste man, an upper caste man, and what the scene is about could be easily guessed. That is, it's an attempt of molestation by the upper caste man on this Dalit woman, and she somehow protests against it, and she narrates the tale to her people. She's the woman who in fact is a little advanced in her thinking, and she wants to bring this to the notice of the people, but somehow, surprisingly, there is not much of support for her from her own people. And Bhama says this: her people were a little against this woman's protest against the upper caste person, because you might of course want to reveal the entire story to the people, but who will listen to you? Because the stories only of the upper caste people will be listened to, and not really of you or us. You cannot kind of ensure for yourselves that your story will be listened to by anybody. Because when you have a story to tell people, there should be one listener at least. And do you think you can be definitely assured of one listener outside? And instead, in case you want to reveal to the people that Kumaraswamy came to molest you, then people will call you a whore. It's not that Kumaraswamy Ayya will be called a debauch. Instead, you will be called a whore. And this has been the case all through Indian history. The moment there is any case of molestation against the Dalit woman or women, they are called the whores, because we have something called Devi and Dasi concept in India and in the scriptures too. Okay, and the word Devi connotatively refers to an upper caste woman, and Dasi refers to a Dalit woman. Okay, I'll give you an interesting example. When contraceptives were introduced in India, okay, that was supposed to be treated as part of women empowerment, because that would give them a sense of protection, and in the meanwhile it would also give them a right to say no to pregnancy, because contraceptives would actually emancipate them from constant pregnancy, because women for a long time were treated as nothing but factories of babies, and we all know about it. And all through their life, until they reached the stage of menopause, they were supposed to be giving birth to children. And contraceptives, when they were first introduced here in India, were opposed, because the upper caste women said, like, these are good only for the lower caste people because they are the ones who are whores. And here we people, the Devis, cannot use it because it would only contaminate our bodies, and we don't really want to say no to pregnancy. It is only those whores who have to say no to pregnancy, and they can keep doing their businesses by way of using these contraceptives. And this actually talks voluminously about the caste system here in India. People, in fact, did not at least understand the introduction of contraceptives, in fact, was meant for the empowerment of women. Rather, that was also interpreted in terms of caste. This is the tragedy of Indian social structure, right? Okay. How much time? Yeah. There's a book which I wanted to refer to, and I'll do that quite quickly. This is a book that was given to me by a friend of mine, who in fact is putting this into English. And he wanted me to also kind of go through this book and also give him certain kind of a feedback. And I found the book quite interesting for one reason, that is, what actually dominates the entire work here is the component of hunger. Right? What dominates the whole book here is the component of hunger. Because when you read a work by an upper caste person, you will find other things dominating the work, but not really hunger. Because hunger has never been part of the upper caste experience. Hunger has been part of only the Dalit experience. When you talk about Dalit experience, it is hunger which matters to them, because they have gone through hunger for everything. And this book became extremely interesting for me because it is dominated by the component of hunger. And I'll refer to just one chapter here from this book. When this guy, the writer of this particular book, finished his high school, he had to join the college. And when he wanted to join the college, he had to first face hundreds of scarcities, and one such scarcity, of course, is arranging for a nominal fee that was charged by his own school people. In the meanwhile, he also had to ensure for himself certain kind of a shelter or a place to stay in. And when he was given a seat in the hostel, he calls the hostel a Punya Bhumi, because it gave me shelter. And when he started his career in PUC, he in fact was in a state of constant excitement, because suddenly there was a sort of perspective that was being constructed in his own mind about the entire world, because all the while he had thought that there was no space for these people in this world. And here, when he got the seat in the hostel, he in fact had to give himself a sense of consolation that there is also something called hostel, called Punya Bhumi, for people like us, right? And here he joined NCC when he was in college, not because of his interest in NCC. He says NCC in fact became interesting for one reason, that is, all these NCC guys were given masala dosas after the march past. And this actually looks like a laughable for us, because masala dosa is something which is part of our daily experience, but for a person who in fact has eaten only ganji all throughout, masala dosa becomes a luxury, something which can be only dreamt about, not really eaten all the time. And here, in case you enlist yourself among the NCC cadets, you will definitely be treated to a plate of masala dosa in the evenings after the march past. And that becomes the major attraction for him to join NCC, and he just goes and joins NCC only with the dream of eating his dream food,
masala dosa. This kind of description will never be found in other works. You can find this kind of description only in Dalit works, because they write straight from their experiences. Like I said, it's not from their minds. One more interesting thing here is they wanted to arrange for their sister, his sister's marriage. And here, when we actually think about arranging for somebody's marriage, it's not really a big thing, because all that we got to do is just call up people and invite them to the marriage, and we have to, of course, make other arrangements because we all have money. But interestingly, this guy, when he had to kind of make arrangements for his sister's marriage, his mother tells him to first locate all their relatives, because they knew that all their relatives were living within the jurisdiction of Karnataka, all right, but nobody had any addresses. I repeat, nobody had any addresses. When Jerin wanted to call me, I had a phone number and I had my own address. I have Aadhaar card also, but these guys did not have or do not have any addresses. And more than arranging for the marriage, what becomes very challenging for the author of this book here is to first locate the addresses of his people. So, when you want to understand who a Dalit is, he is a person who is addressless. He is a person who has absolutely no address. And the book actually became interesting because of this kind of information which is replete, or which is kind of rampant all through the book. Hope I made some sense to you all. Thank you.